Hello. Thank you for coming back to my channel, podcast. I always forgot because I used to make videos on YouTube, and you called your account as channel on YouTube instead of podcast. And this is my second episode. I made the first episode a few days ago, and I surprisingly got 2 comments under the first episode on YouTube. Right, I am sharing the podcast on YouTube and Apple Podcast. These are the 2 platforms that I'm sharing my content on. And I didn't expect to have any listeners, to be honest. So I was so shocked and I was so lucky and an honor to get comments from my listeners. And I do appreciate it. My name is Hubert. If this is your first time to be here, I was born and grew up in China. I've been doing international marketing and branding in China for the past 8 years or 9 years. So it's about 10 years already. And I made this podcast because I realized that there are several differences between Chinese brands and international brands. And I find it pretty interesting because I kind of feel like there's a very big cultural influence behind those differences. And I want to discover why, and I want to explore the logic of marketing and branding with international marketers. It's also the reason why I'm creating the content in English, because I want to communicate with international marketers in order to get a different perspective on marketing and branding. So please, feel free to share your opinion with me on YouTube if you are listening to this podcast on YouTube. The channel is called Hubert Chong, HUBERTCHEUNG. It's my personal YouTube channel, and I used to make videos on this channel, but currently I'm focusing on podcast because I feel like it's easier to make this type of content because I don't have to, look at the camera, and I always have problems with cameras. It's just my personal preferences. And if you are listening to this podcast on Apple Podcast, you may send an email to my personal email address, which is alwayshubert@gmail.com. All right. So in this episode, I would like to discuss several interesting facts with you. The first one is that copy is very important, and we all know that when we are selling our products within China, making a typo could cause big problems, and you're gonna get punished or criticized. At least your leader is not gonna be happy. But making a typo in English when selling products internationally is not such a big deal for Chinese companies. I know that's funny, but I think it's very easy to understand it if you think about it, because English is not our first language, so we are naturally not that sensitive about the language. And Chinese companies have been selling cost competitive products in the past, which means you don't really need to focus on the content or the quality of your content when you have a big advantage of pricing. The chances are consumers are going to find your products on Amazon, and they're going to look at your competitors and realize that you are at least 50% cheaper than your competitors, and chances are they're going to try it out because they can always get a refund or a return on Amazon. It's protected by the platform because they trust Amazon instead of your brand. So why not try it out? They won't lose anything except for time and some troubles. But it's probably totally worth it because it's just so cheap. So it's something that we're all very used to here in China, which makes us neglect some of the errors that or some of the stuff that we should have improved in our content, which is like avoid using unnatural language, avoid making typos, this kind of stuff. But the Chinese e-commerce is actually very advanced and it's well developed. I would say it's very competitive as well. If you want to survive in China, make while selling products in China, it's very competitive. You had to focus on your content. You had to focus on the communication of your product. And here's something that some of the Chinese brands are very used to now, is that they would talk about the founder. They would talk about, a lot of the branding content that, international brands are doing. Chinese brands are also doing that, but within China. So they would let the founder talk about the idea and their experience about founding the brand and developing the product, and some of the stories behind the product development, and some of the emotional stories with their customers. It's something that you can see a lot of international brands like Apple and Samsung that are doing. Chinese brands are also doing that within China, domestically. But when it comes to international market, content becomes not that important. It's so it's probably because, one, language is not our first language, so we are not that sensitive about English or other foreign languages. Two, we realize that it's almost like it's going to be very challenging for Chinese people, for Chinese marketers to work on the content because, again, it's not our first language and we don't necessarily have the cultural background to create good content that could touch the customers in the target country, let's say the US. So instead of working on something that we are not naturally good at, why don't we focus on the product, focus on the specs, make it more cost competitive? Because it's actually something that I think it's an advantage that Chinese companies were born to have, because we have probably the most advanced supply chain in the world here in China. So we could get almost like any product done at a competitive cost. It's also, I think, probably the reason why a lot of Chinese companies are sticking to the price strategy. At the same time, I'm not sure about what it's like in other countries. For example, would you find it funny if a U.S. company, an American company, is trying to sell products to China exclusively, using American marketers only to create the content, to write the copy in Chinese, to communicate with Chinese customers in Chinese, which means, in this situation, the American marketers are not native speakers. They're all learners of Chinese, of Mandarin Chinese, and they are trying to compete with Chinese brands in the market of China. Would you find it funny? At the same time, I think I kind of understand why it's Chinese companies are using Chinese marketers only to write the copy, to communicate with American customers. A lot of people, everyone is, English is such a common language in the world now, so you can easily find someone who can speak English. And the business owners are usually might not be necessarily good at English, so they don't really need to understand the content, or they don't understand the content. As long as you can describe the price correctly and the product correctly, then they're good with it. And also, it's also very difficult to hire a native speaker of English in China. You have to deal with their visa and this language barrier. There's also different work ethic, different cultural background, and let's face it, the population of native speaker in China is just not that high. So they will probably choose like bigger companies like Huawei, Lenovo, DJI, OnePlus, Anchor, this type of Chinese companies because they're more stable. Why would they choose a startup or smaller Chinese companies when they might not be when chances are they might not even be able to afford the salary or the work visa? So please tell me, what's the situation is like in your country? Do you also find this kind of problem? But I know the chances are you're probably also selling your products and your services in English. So do you find that if you're from a non-English speaking country, do you think it's necessary to hire native speakers to work on the content? Or do you think companies in your country are realizing it and are hiring native speakers of English to work on the content? Please let me know in the comment section below. All right, it's almost 11 minutes already. I think it's time to wrap it up. All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. I will share more content about working in China as an international marketer, and also some of the stories about Chinese brands and what the work ethic and work environment in China are like. If you are interested, please let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below on YouTube or just send me an email. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for listening again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I will talk to you next time.